Everything we know about Mars hides a much harsher reality. It looks familiar from orbit, dunes, valleys, even ancient riverbeds. But that familiarity is deceptive. Once you understand the actual surface conditions and exposure risks, the idea of sustained human survival becomes far more complicated. It's an extreme environment we're not fully prepared for. The first grave on Mars. The spacecraft is already falling before anyone on Earth even knows something has gone wrong. That is the first detail that changes everything about Mars missions, and it is the part most people never fully feel until it is too late. The ship is coming in fast, locked into Mars's thin atmosphere, surrounded by silence that no human can break, because every message sent home is already delayed by several minutes. The crew is inside a capsule that looks advanced, tested, and controlled. But at this stage of the journey, control is mostly an illusion held together by systems that must all work at once, without failure, because there is no recovery plan once descent begins. Inside the cabin, the crew is strapped in tightly, their bodies pressed into seats as the spacecraft starts to hit the upper edge of the Martian atmosphere. The first contact with air is not gentle. Even though Mars has an atmosphere, it is so thin that it behaves unpredictably at hypersonic speeds. The spacecraft shakes, not like turbulence in Earth's air, but like something scraping against a surface that is not solid enough to slow it down properly. Heat builds on the outer shell in seconds, rising to thousands of degrees, not because Mars is hot, but because the ship is compressing air in front of it at extreme speed. On Earth, engineers are watching telemetry that is already old. Every number they see is from several minutes ago. If something is wrong now, they will only learn about it later, when the outcome has already been decided. That is the first quiet trap of Mars missions. Communication delay is not a minor inconvenience. It is a hard wall between action and response. The crew might be in danger at this very moment, and Earth will still be calmly reviewing data that no longer reflects reality. As the spacecraft descends deeper, it enters the most dangerous phase of any Mars landing. This is the point where everything depends on a chain of systems that must all respond perfectly in sequence. Heat shield performance, atmospheric drag calculations, navigation corrections, parachute deployment timing and propulsion firing all have to work together without error. There is no room for improvisation. There is no human hand reaching in to adjust things in real time from Earth. Every decision has already been coded into automated sequences that cannot adapt beyond their limits. Then something small begins to drift out of range. It could be a sensor that reads air density slightly wrong. It could be a navigation update that arrives too late to adjust the angle of descent. It could be a timing mismatch in the parachute deployment window, measured in seconds, not minutes. On Earth, this would be a fixable situation. On Mars, it becomes the beginning of a chain reaction that cannot be stopped. The spacecraft begins to tilt slightly off its planned descent path. At first, the change is so small, it looks harmless in the data stream. But Mars does not forgive small errors at hypersonic speed. A fraction of a degree in angle can turn controlled entry into uncontrolled skipping, where the capsule bounces off the upper atmosphere instead of slowing down smoothly. If it skips too high, it loses critical braking time. If it dives too steep, it burns too fast and reaches the ground without enough deceleration. Inside the cabin, the crew may not even know yet. They are still focused on vibration, on the sound of stress in the hull, on the countdown timers that were supposed to guide them through the descent phase. But outside, the spacecraft is no longer following the exact path it was designed for. The correction thrusters fire, but they are limited. They cannot fully reverse a trajectory that has already drifted too far off course in a medium where there is almost no air to push against. On Earth, Mission Control starts seeing warning flags, not alarms that scream immediately, but subtle indicators that something is outside expected tolerance. The problem is that by the time these flags appear, the spacecraft is already deep in the atmosphere. Any instruction sent now will arrive too late to matter. The response window is gone. The delay is not just communication lag anymore, it is a full separation from control. This is where Mars becomes very different from every other place humans have ever tried to land. On the Moon, communication delay is instant. On Earth, control is immediate. Even on orbital missions, adjustments can be made quickly. But here, the spacecraft is operating alone in a zone where decisions must be correct the first time, every time, without feedback in real time. The descent continues, but stability is no longer guaranteed. The heat shield is still doing its job, but the angle is wrong enough that one side is under more stress than designed. Temperatures spike unevenly. The structure begins to experience forces it was not fully optimized for. The parachute deployment window approaches, but the software is now unsure whether to trigger it, because altitude and velocity readings no longer match the planned profile. If the parachutes deploy too early, they snap under pressure because the air is too thin to slow the craft properly. If they deploy too late, there is not enough time left to reduce speed before impact. Everything depends on timing that cannot be corrected once it is missed. Inside, the crew feels a shift, the kind of shift that trained astronauts recognize immediately, even without instruments. The descent no longer feels smooth or predictable. The vibration pattern changes. The braking profile is no longer stable. This is the point where human instinct starts to pick up what automated systems are still trying to interpret. On Earth, engineers are now fully aware that something is off, but awareness is not control. They can see the divergence, but they cannot reach into it. Messages still travel at the speed of light, but that speed is meaningless when the spacecraft is already seconds away from a decision point that determines survival. The parachutes deploy, but not under ideal conditions. They open into an atmosphere that is too thin to fully catch them, and the sudden load creates stress across the attachment points. The capsule slows slightly, but not enough. It is still moving far too fast for a safe landing. That means the next system must engage immediately. Powered descent engines. These engines were designed for a narrow window of operation. They are meant to fire at a precise altitude and reduce speed just enough to allow a soft touchdown. But now the altitude is uncertain, the velocity is higher than expected, and the timing has already drifted off sequence. When the engines ignite, they compensate aggressively, but Mars does not give much reaction force to push against. The thin air offers little resistance, so the control is fragile, almost like trying to balance on something that is not stable enough to stand on. The spacecraft drops lower, but not smoothly. It is no longer a controlled descent in the way the mission planned it. It is a managed fall, trying to correct itself in real time without enough environmental support to do so. The ground is coming closer, but the systems still believe they have more time than they actually do. Inside, the crew is now fully aware that something is wrong, not in theory, but in physical reality. The braking feels uneven. The descent rate does not match expectations. The final landing phase is approaching, but there is no confidence that the landing will be soft or even survivable. And this is where the final problem of Mars reveals itself fully. Even if everything else had worked, even if communication was instant, even if systems were perfect, even if no errors existed in navigation or timing, the landing itself is still one of the hardest engineering problems ever attempted. Mars does not help slow anything down. Its atmosphere is too thin to act like Earth's protective cushion, but thick enough to create unpredictable drag. It sits in the worst possible middle ground for entry systems. The spacecraft is now committed. There is no abort option. There is no return trajectory. There is no rescue vehicle waiting. Even if Earth sent instructions immediately at this exact moment, those instructions would arrive after the landing outcome has already been decided. The final seconds begin to compress everything into a narrow window of survival. Altitude drops quickly, Speed is still too high. Engines are firing, but not with perfect stability. The surface of Mars is no longer a distant target. It is an immediate endpoint that cannot be avoided. And in this exact situation, something becomes clear that defines every Mars mission ever planned. The spacecraft is not being guided down in real time. It is executing a pre-calculated descent that only works if every single assumption holds true without deviation. The moment even one assumption breaks, the system cannot fully recover. Rescue, at this point, does not exist as a concept. There is no vehicle on standby. There is no fast response launch from Earth. Even the fastest possible mission would take months just to prepare and years to arrive. The spacecraft is alone in the most literal sense possible, further away from help than any human has ever been. The final descent phase is now fully outside safe parameters. The ground is coming in fast. The engines are struggling to stabilize vertical speed. The parachutes are no longer enough. Every system is still working, but working is not the same as succeeding in this environment. And this is the moment where Mars stops behaving like a destination and starts revealing what it actually is. A place where human presence is not supported by natural conditions, not even slightly. A place where every landing is a controlled collapse and every mistake, no matter how small, becomes permanent. There is no second chance in this sequence, no recovery window, no external correction. Only the final interaction between machine, atmosphere and ground, decided in seconds that no one on Earth can influence anymore. And in the middle of this descent, that reality becomes unavoidable, because the spacecraft is already too close to change its fate, and Earth is already too far away to matter in real time. Why we can't even reach Mars safely yet. When people talk about sending humans to Mars, the conversation almost always begins with technology. People talk about giant rockets, powerful engines, and futuristic spacecraft that can cross millions of kilometers of empty space. It sounds like an engineering problem. Build a bigger rocket, carry more fuel, and eventually humans will stand on Mars. But the reality is much more complicated than that. The truth is that we still do not know how to safely get human beings to Mars. That may sound surprising because humans have been going to space for more than 60 years. We have sent astronauts to the moon, built space stations, and kept people in orbit for months at a time. We have landed robots on distant worlds and sent probes beyond the edges of our solar system. Looking at all of those achievements, it feels like a trip to Mars should simply be the next step. It is not. In fact, every human being who has ever left Earth has remained incredibly close to home. The International Space Station, which many people think of as deep space, orbits only about 400 kilometers above Earth's surface. That sounds far away until you compare it to Mars. Even at its closest point, Mars is more than 50 million kilometers from Earth, and at its farthest, it can be over 400 million kilometers away. That is not just a longer journey, it is an entirely different kind of mission. The astronauts on the International Space Station are never truly cut off from Earth. They can talk to mission control instantly. Supply ships can bring food, equipment, and experiments. If a serious medical emergency happens, there is a way to bring the crew home. Rescue may be difficult, but it is possible. None of that exists on the way to Mars. The moment a spacecraft leaves Earth's neighborhood, the crew enters a place where there is no quick return, no rescue vehicle waiting nearby, and no way to fix a major mistake by simply coming home. Every decision matters because the astronauts are going farther than any human beings have ever gone before. That is the first thing that makes a Mars mission so dangerous. It is not just the distance, it is what that distance takes away. A mission to Mars using today's technology takes between 6 and 9 months. That estimate assumes everything goes according to plan. No major technical failures, no unexpected emergencies, and no serious health problems. Even in the best case, astronauts would spend most of a year inside a spacecraft before ever seeing the Martian surface. Think about what that actually means. Imagine living inside a small building with the same few people every day for 8 straight months. There is no fresh air. There is no change of scenery. There are no walks outside, no restaurants, no crowded streets, and no ordinary life. Every day begins to look almost exactly like the one before it. Now imagine something goes wrong. A fire breaks out, a piece of equipment stops working, someone becomes seriously ill. There is no hospital waiting for you. There is no emergency landing. There is no way to call for immediate help. The spacecraft itself becomes your entire world. That is the journey before Mars even appears outside the window. Then there is the danger that astronauts cannot see at all: radiation. Most people go through life without ever thinking about the invisible shield that protects our planet. Earth has a magnetic field that stretches far into space and acts like a giant barrier against dangerous particles coming from the Sun and from deep space. Without that protection, life on Earth would be very different. The International Space Station still receives radiation because it is above much of Earth's atmosphere, but it remains within a large part of our planet's protective magnetic environment. Astronauts there receive more radiation than people on Earth, yet they are still far safer than they would be in deep space. A mission to Mars changes that completely. The moment astronauts leave Earth's protective bubble, they become exposed to an environment that no human being has ever experienced for such a long period of time. Deep space is filled with high-energy particles moving at incredible speeds. Some come from the Sun during violent eruptions known as solar storms. Others come from distant explosions in our galaxy and have been travelling through space for millions of years. These particles are dangerous because they can pass through spacecraft walls and into the human body. They can damage cells, break apart molecules, and harm DNA itself. Scientists worry that long-term exposure could increase the risk of cancer, damage the nervous system, affect blood vessels, and even change how the brain functions. The frightening part is that there is no perfect solution. You can build thicker shielding around a spacecraft, but thicker shielding means more weight. More weight means more fuel. More fuel means a larger and more expensive spacecraft. Every solution creates another problem. Even after decades of research, there is still no clear answer to how astronauts can be fully protected from deep space radiation during a mission to Mars. And there is nowhere to hide from it. For 6 to 9 months, the crew would wake up every day in an environment where radiation exposure slowly keeps building. There would be no atmosphere overhead and no magnetic field surrounding them. Every day of the journey adds another small amount of damage. Then there is another problem that people rarely think about. The human body was built to live under gravity. Every muscle, every bone, and every organ evolved under the constant pull of Earth. The moment that pull disappears, the body begins changing in ways that can become dangerous. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station spend around 2 hours every day exercising. They are not doing it to stay fit or pass the time. They exercise because their bodies are fighting against the effects of space itself. Without gravity, muscles begin shrinking. The body becomes extremely efficient at getting rid of things it believes are no longer needed. Since astronauts do not need to walk, climb stairs, or hold themselves upright in microgravity, the body starts reducing muscle mass. Imagine lying in bed for several months and barely using your legs. Your muscles would become weaker. Now imagine that happening to nearly your entire body. Even with strict exercise programs, astronauts still lose strength during long missions. That raises a serious question. What condition will astronauts be in after spending 8 months on their way to Mars? Because arriving on Mars is not the end of the mission. It is the beginning of an even harder one. They still have to land safely. They still have to work outside the spacecraft. They still have to set up equipment, explore, and survive in one of the harshest environments in the solar system. A body that has spent months growing weaker is not in the best condition for those tasks. The muscles are only one part of the problem. Bones suffer as well. Our skeleton is constantly rebuilding itself. Old bone breaks down while new bone forms. Gravity plays a major role in keeping this process balanced. When gravity disappears, the balance changes. Astronauts can lose around 1 to 2% of their bone density every month in space. That may not sound dramatic at first, but think about it another way. Many older adults on Earth lose around 1% of their bone density over an entire year. An astronaut can lose that much in a single month. During an 8-month journey to Mars, the amount of bone loss could become a major concern. And some of that loss may not fully recover. This is not just about becoming weaker. Bones that lose density become more fragile and more likely to break. A broken bone on Earth is usually painful and inconvenient. A broken bone millions of kilometers from home could become a serious emergency. The problems do not stop there. Even the heart changes in space. Gravity constantly affects how blood moves through the human body. Remove that gravity and fluids begin shifting upward. Astronauts often develop puffy faces and thinner legs because blood and other fluids no longer settle in the lower body the way they do on Earth. Over time, the heart no longer needs to work as hard. Like any muscle that is not used as much, it can begin changing too. Some astronauts returning from long missions have trouble standing up. Some experience problems with blood pressure and balance. Their bodies need time to readjust to gravity. Now imagine reaching Mars after 8 months of travel. Mars does have gravity, but only about 38% of Earth's. Nobody knows exactly what living in that environment for years would do to the human body. Nobody knows whether it is enough to keep bones healthy or muscles strong. Nobody knows whether the human cardiovascular system can function normally there over long periods of time. There are huge gaps in our knowledge. And that is one of the most surprising things about the dream of colonizing Mars. We often talk about building cities there, but we still do not know how the human body would respond to years of living under Martian gravity. Then there is the challenge that cannot be measured with medical instruments: the human mind. Long before anyone goes to Mars, scientists have been trying to understand what prolonged isolation does to people. One of the most famous experiments is called HISEAS. In this project, crews lived inside a habitat in Hawaii designed to imitate some of the conditions of a Mars mission. They wore mock spacesuits when they went outside, followed strict schedules, and lived in isolation for long periods. But there was one important difference. They were still on Earth. They still had fresh air outside. They still knew that if something went seriously wrong, help was available. And even under those conditions, researchers discovered how difficult long-term isolation can become. Small disagreements grew larger over time. Minor frustrations became major issues. People became tired of the same routines and the same surroundings. Living with the same few people, day after day, created stress that built slowly. A real Mars mission would be even harder. There is no stepping outside without a spacesuit. There is no weekend trip or break from the environment. There is no way to simply spend time alone somewhere else. The crew is together all the time. Every misunderstanding matters. Every personality difference matters. Every conflict matters. A single bad day for one crew member can affect everyone else because every person inside that spacecraft depends on everyone around them. Then there is the communication delay. This may sound like a small inconvenience until you really think about it. On Earth, we are used to immediate communication. We send messages and get responses within seconds. We make phone calls and hear another person's voice instantly. None of that exists on a trip to Mars. Depending on the positions of Earth and Mars, Messages can take anywhere from 4 to 24 minutes to travel one way. That means a simple conversation becomes impossible. Ask a question. Wait. Receive an answer much later. Then wait again. Even in an emergency, there is no real-time communication with mission control. Imagine facing a frightening situation and knowing that any advice from Earth may take nearly an hour to become part of an actual conversation. The psychological effect of that delay could be enormous. Earth would begin to feel more distant than ever before. Friends and family would still exist. Mission control would still exist, but they would no longer feel present. The crew would increasingly depend on each other because they would have no one else. Scientists studying isolated groups on Earth have found increased stress, sleep problems, anxiety, depression, and conflicts between team members. Now imagine those same pressures inside a spacecraft traveling millions of kilometers from home. Imagine receiving news that someone you love is sick. Imagine learning that something important has happened on Earth. You cannot come back. You cannot make a normal phone call. You cannot sit with your family. You cannot do anything except continue moving farther away. No human being has ever experienced that kind of isolation. That is important to remember. Nobody has spent years traveling through deep space. Nobody has lived on Mars. Nobody has been so far away that Earth became a distant point in the sky. Everything we know comes from simulations, studies, and educated guesses. When people talk about going to Mars, it often sounds as though we are simply repeating something we already know how to do. We are not. A mission to Mars would push human beings into conditions we have never experienced before. The journey is longer than any human space mission in history. The radiation environment is more dangerous than anything astronauts have faced. The effects on muscles, bones, and the heart remain major concerns. The psychological pressures of isolation and delayed communication are still filled with unanswered questions. Even before we start talking about landing on Mars or building a base there, we are faced with a difficult truth. We still do not know whether human beings can safely endure everything that happens on the long road between Earth and the Red Planet, the radiation death zone between Earth and Mars. When a spacecraft leaves Earth orbit and starts moving toward Mars, it is not just moving through empty space, it is entering an environment that is constantly active, constantly dangerous, and completely invisible to the human eye. There is no warning system you can rely on, no visible signal that tells you when conditions become worse, and no natural shelter waiting along the way. From the moment Earth's protective environment fades away, the crew is exposed to a level of radiation that human bodies were never designed to handle for long periods. And this is one of the first real barriers that makes Mars travel so difficult, even before we talk about landing or living on the surface. To understand why this zone is so dangerous, you first need to understand what Earth normally does for us without us ever noticing. The planet is surrounded by something called a magnetosphere, which is not a physical wall, but a magnetic field that stretches far into space and acts like a shield against charged particles moving at extreme speeds. These particles come from different sources, but the important thing is that Earth deflects a large portion of them before they ever reach the surface. Without this protection, the constant flow of energy coming from space would slowly damage living tissue over time, and life as we know it would be under far more pressure to survive. Inside low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station operates, astronauts are still partially protected by this system, even though they are above the thickest part of the atmosphere. They do receive higher radiation exposure than people on the ground, but they are not fully outside Earth's protective field. The difference becomes obvious the moment you imagine leaving that region completely, because once a spacecraft moves beyond that boundary, there is no gradual transition into safety or danger. It is simply the absence of protection. One of the most serious sources of radiation in deep space is something called galactic cosmic rays, often shortened to GCRs. These are not regular particles in the simple sense. They are extremely high-energy fragments of atoms that have been accelerated by powerful events in space, often linked to supernova explosions or other violent cosmic processes. These particles can travel through the galaxy for millions of years, moving at speeds so high that when they finally pass through a spacecraft, they do not behave like normal radiation. They behave more like microscopic bullets passing through metal, equipment, and even human tissue with enough energy to disrupt the structure of cells along their path. What makes galactic cosmic rays especially dangerous is not just their strength, but their persistence. They are not rare events that happen once in a while. They are constantly present in deep space. That means a spacecraft traveling to Mars is not moving through a calm, empty void. It is moving through a continuous stream of high-energy particles that never fully stops. Even when nothing dramatic is happening, even when the sun is quiet and space looks stable, this background radiation is always there, passing through the ship and the people inside it, without any visible sign. Inside the spacecraft, there is no way to escape this exposure. The hull provides some protection, but it cannot fully block these particles because of how powerful they are. Some particles pass through with little resistance, and others collide with atoms in the structure itself, creating secondary radiation inside the ship. This means the spacecraft is not just a shielded box, it is also a place where radiation can interact with materials and produce additional particles that continue the exposure process from inside the environment. The difficulty increases when you consider how long the journey takes. A trip to Mars is not a short exposure. It lasts for 6 to 9 months under ideal conditions. And during that entire time, the crew is continuously inside this radiation field. There is no break, no safe zone along the way, and no way to pause the journey and wait for conditions to improve. The exposure is slow but constant, which is one of the reasons scientists treat it as a long-term health risk rather than a short-term hazard. At this stage, it is important to understand that galactic cosmic rays are only part of the radiation environment, but even on their own, they already create a serious baseline level of risk. When scientists estimate mission exposure, they measure it in units that represent biological impact, and even in low Earth orbit, astronauts already receive more radiation than people on the ground over the same period. But once you move toward a Mars mission profile, that exposure increases significantly because the protection from Earth's magnetic field becomes weaker and eventually disappears completely. This is where the numbers start to become important in a very practical way. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station typically receive around 150 millisieverts of radiation per year, depending on solar activity and shielding conditions. That number is already much higher than what a person would experience on Earth, but it is still within a range that space agencies consider manageable for long-duration missions in low Earth orbit. However, once you move into a Mars transfer mission, the estimated total exposure for a round trip can rise to somewhere between 600 and 1,000 millisieverts, depending on travel time, solar conditions, and shielding design. What matters here is not just the difference in numbers, but the timescale and environment behind them. The ISS exposure happens while still partially inside Earth's protection, with regular resupply missions and the ability to return astronauts if needed. A Mars mission exposure happens in deep space, far from any support, over many continuous months, where every additional day adds to the cumulative biological impact, with no opportunity to reduce or reset that exposure. At this point, the radiation environment is not just a background detail, it becomes a central design constraint for the entire mission. Engineers cannot treat it as something that can be ignored or dealt with later, because it directly affects how long humans can safely travel, how spacecraft must be built, and how missions are planned from start to finish. The problem is that galactic cosmic rays are not the only source of radiation in this region, and the situation becomes more complex when solar activity is added into the picture, which introduces sudden and unpredictable changes in exposure levels that can be far more intense than the steady background. Before moving into those solar events, what matters most in this first layer of understanding is recognizing that deep space between Earth and Mars is not empty and inactive. It is a constantly active radiation environment shaped by distant cosmic events that humans have no control over and no ability to stop. Every spacecraft traveling through this region is essentially moving through a field of invisible energy that interacts with everything inside it. And the longer the journey lasts, the more significant that interaction becomes for the human body and for the safety of the mission as a whole. Solar particle events, ASPEs. Unpredictable radiation storms. The danger in deep space does not come from one constant source alone, and this is where the situation becomes even more unstable for any mission heading toward Mars. Alongside the steady background of galactic cosmic rays, there is another type of radiation that is far less predictable and far more dangerous in short bursts, and this is what scientists call solar particle events. These are sudden radiation storms released by the Sun when it becomes highly active. And unlike the constant background radiation of deep space, these events arrive without clear warning and can change conditions around a spacecraft within minutes. To understand why this matters so much for a Mars mission, it helps to picture the Sun not as a calm light source, but as a constantly active star that occasionally releases massive bursts of energy into space. During these bursts, the Sun ejects large amounts of charged particles at extremely high speeds, and when one of these bursts is directed toward a spacecraft, it creates a sudden spike in radiation levels that can be many times higher than normal background exposure. These events do not follow a simple pattern that engineers can fully rely on, which means they cannot be scheduled, predicted with precision, or avoided once a spacecraft is already in deep space. Inside low Earth orbit, astronauts still have some level of protection during these events because Earth's magnetic field helps deflect a portion of the incoming particles, reducing the intensity of exposure. Even then, space agencies closely monitor solar activity and sometimes instruct astronauts to move into more shielded parts of the spacecraft when solar storms are expected. But this kind of protection depends heavily on being close enough to Earth's magnetic environment to benefit from it. And once a spacecraft moves toward Mars, that protective advantage becomes weaker and eventually disappears completely. In deep space, a solar particle event becomes a direct exposure risk for the crew, and the main problem is not just the intensity of the radiation, but the timing. These events can develop quickly, and while solar observatories can sometimes detect early signs of increased activity, the warning time is limited and may not be enough to make major adjustments in a spacecraft already millions of kilometers from Earth. This creates a situation where astronauts must rely on pre-built shielding and emergency protocols rather than real-time intervention from mission control, which is another example of how distance removes control from the people on Earth. The impact of these events can be extremely serious because the radiation levels can rise sharply over a short period of time, creating what is essentially a radiation storm passing through the spacecraft. During such an event, the crew is not just dealing with a slightly higher background level, but a sudden spike that can significantly increase total mission exposure in a matter of hours or days. If a strong solar particle event occurs during a Mars transfer mission, it can contribute a large portion of the total radiation dose that astronauts receive for the entire journey, depending on shielding and duration of exposure. This is where measured dose comparisons become important, because they show the scale of the risk in a way that is easy to understand. On the International Space Station, average annual radiation exposure is around 150 millisieverts, although this number can vary depending on solar activity and orbital conditions. Even though this is higher than Earth's surface levels, it is still within what space agencies currently consider acceptable for extended missions in low Earth orbit, where return to Earth is always possible if needed. However, when you move from low Earth orbit to a Mars mission profile, the estimated total radiation exposure changes significantly. For a round-trip journey to Mars, including travel time in both directions and time spent in deep space outside Earth's protective field, the total dose is estimated to fall somewhere between 600 and 1,000 millisieverts. This range depends on factors such as solar activity, spacecraft shielding, mission duration, and the exact trajectory used. But even the lower end of that range represents a major increase compared to what astronauts experience on the International Space Station. The key difference is not just the total number, but how that exposure is distributed. On the ISS, radiation exposure is spread over time in a relatively controlled environment, with partial protection from Earth's magnetosphere and the possibility of emergency response. On a Mars mission, the same or higher total dose is received in a fully exposed deep space environment where solar particle events can suddenly increase radiation levels in unpredictable bursts, adding stress to both the human body and the spacecraft systems. When you combine solar particle events with the constant background of galactic cosmic rays, the result is a layered radiation environment that is both steady and unpredictable at the same time. The crew is always exposed to a baseline level of radiation, and on top of that baseline, sudden spikes can occur without much warning. This means that even if a mission is carefully planned and shielded as much as current technology allows, there is still an unavoidable element of risk that comes from the natural behavior of the Sun itself. What makes this especially important for Mars travel is that the duration of exposure is long enough for these events to matter in a cumulative way. A mission lasting 6 to 9 months in one direction alone provides enough time for multiple solar particle events to potentially occur, and each one adds to the total radiation dose the crew receives. Even if a spacecraft is designed to reduce exposure during these events, the effectiveness of that protection is limited by weight, material constraints, and the simple fact that there is no way to completely block high-energy particles in deep space without creating other serious engineering problems. At this stage, the radiation environment between Earth and Mars is no longer just a background risk. It becomes a defining constraint on human travel. The combination of constant galactic cosmic rays and unpredictable solar particle events creates a situation where astronauts are exposed to both steady long-term damage and sudden short-term spikes, all while being far from any possibility of evacuation or rapid medical response. This is why radiation is not treated as a secondary concern in Mars mission planning, but as one of the central challenges that shapes every decision about spacecraft design, mission timing, and crew safety from the very beginning. Tissue damage mechanisms. Once radiation passes through spacecraft shielding and enters the human body, the real danger shifts from the environment into the biology itself, because at that point the problem is no longer about what surrounds the crew, but what is happening inside their cells in real time during months of continuous exposure. High-energy particles moving through space do not simply pass harmlessly through tissue, they interact with atoms in the body in a way that disrupts normal cellular structure, and the most sensitive target in this entire process is DNA, the internal system that controls how every cell functions, repairs itself, and reproduces. One of the most important forms of damage caused by deep space radiation is known as DNA double-strand breaks, which occurs when both strands of the DNA molecule are broken at the same time inside a cell. This is far more serious than minor damage because it removes the natural template the cell normally uses to repair itself correctly, forcing the repair system to rebuild genetic information under stress. In many cases, cells can manage small levels of damage, but in deep space conditions, the exposure is not a single event. It is repeated over months, meaning repair systems are constantly working under pressure. When repair becomes imperfect, small errors begin to remain in the genetic code, and over time, these errors can accumulate in ways that change how cells behave. This process becomes especially important when you look at how the human body handles damaged cells over long periods. Normally, the body has systems that detect and remove cells that behave abnormally, but when radiation exposure is continuous, the number of damaged cells increases faster than the body can fully correct or eliminate them. This is where the long-term concern of increased cancer probability becomes relevant, because cancer is not a sudden effect of radiation. It is a delayed outcome that can develop when repeated DNA damage leads to uncontrolled cell growth. The risk is not immediate illness during the mission, but a higher statistical chance that damaged cells may develop into serious disease over time, especially when exposure happens outside Earth's protective environment for extended periods without interruption. At the same time, radiation does not only affect cells that divide rapidly, it also affects the nervous system, which is one of the most sensitive and complex systems in the human body. The brain and connected neural structures rely on stable cellular connections to process information, store memory, and regulate behavior. But high-energy particles can disrupt these connections at a microscopic level. Research from animal studies exposed to radiation levels similar to deep space conditions has shown evidence of changes in cognitive performance, including reduced memory function and altered learning behavior, suggesting that long-term exposure may influence how the brain processes information under stress. These findings are important because they point to potential central nervous system effects that are not immediately visible during exposure, but may develop gradually as damage accumulates. Unlike physical injuries that can be seen and treated quickly, changes in cognitive function may be subtle at first, affecting reaction time, decision-making, or memory consistency in ways that are difficult to detect during a mission. This becomes even more critical in a Mars mission environment where astronauts are already operating under isolation, delayed communication, and physical stress, meaning any reduction in cognitive stability could affect mission safety in indirect but serious ways. What makes all of this more complex is that radiation damage in deep space is not caused by a single event or a single type of particle, but by a continuous flow of high-energy interactions happening throughout the entire journey. Every particle that passes through tissue has the potential to create microscopic changes, and while the body has repair mechanisms, those mechanisms are not designed to operate under constant bombardment for months without relief. This creates a situation where biological systems are not dealing with one injury, but with a persistent background process of damage and repair happening at the same time, which increases the chance of imperfect recovery at the cellular level. When you combine DNA double-strand breaks, increased cancer probability, and potential central nervous system effects, the result is not a single point of failure in the body, but a layered biological risk that builds slowly over time. The danger is not that astronauts would suddenly become sick during the journey, but that their bodies are being continuously exposed to conditions that increase long-term biological instability, especially in systems that depend on precise cellular function like the brain and genetic repair mechanisms. All of this leads into the practical limitation of current spacecraft protection, because shielding is the only barrier between deep space radiation and human tissue. Yet that shielding is far from perfect. Most spacecraft are built with materials like aluminum, which provide structural strength and some level of radiation reduction. But high-energy particles from deep space are capable of passing through these materials or interacting with them in ways that produce secondary radiation inside the spacecraft. This means shielding reduces exposure but does not eliminate it, and in some cases it can even shift the type of radiation environment inside the vehicle, rather than fully blocking it. Other proposed shielding solutions, such as water-based protection or hydrogen-rich materials, can improve radiation absorption. But they introduce a major engineering problem because they significantly increase the mass of the spacecraft. Increased mass requires more fuel, more powerful launch systems, and more complex mission designs, which quickly reaches the limits of current rocket technology. This creates a constant trade-off where improving radiation protection makes the mission harder to launch, while reducing mass makes the crew more exposed. And there is no current design that fully resolves both constraints at the same time. Because of these physical and engineering limits, no existing spacecraft can fully remove radiation exposure on a Mars mission. The best possible approach with current technology is reduction, not elimination, which means astronauts would still be living inside an environment where radiation is always present, always active, and always interacting with their bodies throughout the entire journey. Current shielding limits. When engineers design a spacecraft for long-distance travel like a mission to Mars, the first and most basic layer of protection against radiation comes from the structure of the vehicle itself, and in almost every modern design that structure is built around aluminum. Aluminum is used because it is lightweight compared to most metals. It is strong enough to survive launch conditions, and it can be shaped into pressurized cabins that keep astronauts alive in space. On the surface, it looks like a practical solution, but when you place it in the environment between Earth and Mars, its limitations become very clear. Because aluminum does not fully stop high-energy radiation, it only reduces part of it. The main issue is that galactic cosmic rays and similar high-energy particles are powerful enough to pass through aluminum hulls, with significant energy still intact. Instead of being fully absorbed, many of these particles interact with the material and create secondary radiation inside the spacecraft, which means the interior environment is still exposed even after shielding. This creates a situation where the hull is not a complete barrier, but more of a partial filter, reducing some exposure while still allowing dangerous particles to reach the crew over long periods of time. Trying to solve this by simply adding more aluminum is not a practical solution, because every additional layer increases the total mass of the spacecraft, and mass is one of the most critical limitations in space travel. A heavier spacecraft requires more fuel to launch from Earth, more powerful rockets to accelerate it toward Mars, and more complex structural support to handle the forces involved in leaving Earth's gravity. This quickly creates a chain reaction where improving radiation protection directly makes the mission harder to launch and more expensive to sustain, without fully solving the underlying exposure problem. Because of these limits, engineers have explored alternative shielding materials, and one of the most widely studied options is water. Water contains hydrogen, which is more effective at slowing down certain types of high-energy particles compared to metals like aluminum. In theory, surrounding crew areas with water could significantly reduce radiation exposure, and some spacecraft designs even consider using stored drinking water or wastewater as part of a layered shielding system to maximize efficiency without adding entirely new materials. In practice, however, this approach also runs into serious physical constraints. Water is heavy, and the amount required to provide meaningful protection over a 6 to 9 month journey is large enough to significantly increase the spacecraft's total mass. Once again, this creates a direct trade-off between safety and feasibility, because adding enough water to meaningfully reduce radiation would require a much larger launch system, more fuel consumption, and more complex mission architecture than current technology comfortably supports for a Mars mission profile. Other advanced shielding concepts, such as layered materials or hybrid structures combining metals, polymers, and hydrogen-rich compounds, can improve protection in specific scenarios. but none of them fully eliminate exposure to high-energy cosmic radiation. The reason is not just material choice, but the nature of the particles themselves, which carry enough energy to penetrate or interact with almost any known material in ways that produce secondary effects inside the spacecraft. This means shielding can reduce risk, but it cannot create a fully safe environment in deep space with current engineering approaches. When all of these limitations are combined, aluminum inefficiency, water-based mass penalties, and the incomplete performance of advanced materials, the result is a clear constraint on modern space travel. No current spacecraft design is capable of fully solving the radiation problem for a Mars mission, because every improvement in shielding introduces a new cost in weight, fuel, or complexity. And no configuration currently exists that breaks this balance in a meaningful way. This is why radiation protection is not treated as a problem with a single final solution, but as a continuous compromise between what is physically possible to launch and what is biologically safe for long-duration human travel. The spacecraft can be improved, optimized, and reinforced, but it cannot be turned into a completely sealed environment against deep space radiation using today's technology, which means that any human mission to Mars would still operate inside a partially exposed system for the entire duration of the journey. Life support, a closed system that must never fail. A mission to Mars is often imagined as a long flight through space, but inside the spacecraft there is no real comparison to anything on Earth, because the crew is not simply traveling from one place to another. They are living inside a fully sealed survival system that must continuously create everything needed to keep humans alive for months without interruption. Every breath of air, every drop of water, and every gram of usable food is part of a controlled cycle that has no natural backup, and the moment any part of that cycle begins to fail, the entire mission starts moving toward danger in a way that cannot be paused or reset. The first and most basic requirement of this closed system is oxygen generation, because without a constant supply of breathable air, survival inside the spacecraft would end within minutes. On modern spacecraft, oxygen is not stored in unlimited tanks for long missions, because carrying enough compressed oxygen for 9 months would be far too heavy and inefficient. So instead, engineers rely on systems that actively produce oxygen through chemical and electrical processes. One of the main methods used in space today is electrolysis, where water is split into hydrogen and oxygen using electricity, allowing astronauts to breathe the oxygen while the hydrogen is either stored or used in other chemical reactions inside the system. This process works, but it depends entirely on power, water availability, and system stability, because if any part of the electrolysis system fails, oxygen production immediately drops, and there is no natural backup supply waiting in space. To make the system more efficient, spacecraft also use chemical loops like the Sabatier reaction, where carbon dioxide exhaled by astronauts is combined with hydrogen to produce water and methane, allowing the water to be reused again for oxygen production. This creates a partial recycling loop that reduces waste and increases efficiency, but it is still a controlled industrial process happening inside a small spacecraft, and it must operate continuously for the entire duration of the mission without interruption. Alongside oxygen production, the spacecraft must also deal with carbon dioxide removal, because humans constantly produce CO2 when they breathe, and in a sealed environment, that gas would quickly reach dangerous levels if it were not actively removed. Early space missions used simple chemical systems like lithium hydroxide canisters, which absorb carbon dioxide and remove it from the air. But these systems are single-use, meaning once the chemical is saturated, it stops working and must be replaced. For short missions, this is manageable, but for a Mars mission lasting many months, relying only on disposable systems would require carrying large amounts of replacement material, which quickly becomes impractical due to weight and storage limits. Because of this limitation, modern spacecraft also use regenerable carbon dioxide scrubbing systems, which can be reused multiple times by cycling the absorbed CO2 through chemical processes that release it in controlled conditions. These systems are more efficient and reduce the need for constant resupply, but they also introduce complexity because they rely on pumps, filters, sensors, and chemical stability over long periods of continuous operation. If any part of this system begins to fail or lose efficiency, carbon dioxide levels inside the spacecraft can slowly rise, and even small changes in air composition can affect human performance, sleep quality, and cognitive function over time. Water management is another critical part of this closed system because, unlike oxygen, water cannot be simply created in large amounts inside the spacecraft, so it must be carefully recycled and reused as efficiently as possible. Modern spacecraft can recover and recycle a very high percentage of water, often estimated between 90 and 98%, depending on system performance, by collecting moisture from breath, sweat, and even waste processing systems. This water is then purified and reused for drinking, hygiene, and oxygen production, creating one of the most advanced recycling systems ever built by humans. Even though this level of recycling is extremely efficient by Earth standards, it is still not perfect, and that small percentage of loss becomes critical over long durations, like a Mars mission. Every small leak, contamination issue, or system inefficiency slowly reduces the total water supply, and there is no natural source to replace it once the spacecraft is far from Earth. This means that water is not just a resource, it is a carefully balanced system that must remain stable for the entire mission duration without significant loss or contamination. Food introduces a different type of limitation because, unlike oxygen and water, food cannot be fully recycled inside the spacecraft during transit with current technology. Astronauts rely on pre-packed meals that are carefully designed for long shelf life, but even these foods gradually degrade in quality, texture, and nutritional value over time. The longer the mission lasts, the more important it becomes to maintain nutritional balance, because small deficiencies in vitamins or calories over months can begin to affect physical strength, immune function, and overall performance. Attempts to introduce full self-sustaining agriculture inside a spacecraft during transit face serious limitations due to space, light availability, water requirements, and system complexity. Growing plants in microgravity or low-gravity environments requires controlled lighting systems, nutrient delivery systems, and environmental stability that are extremely difficult to maintain inside a moving spacecraft for months without interruption. Even experimental systems on the International Space Station are small-scale and not capable of producing enough food to sustain a full crew for long periods, which means that for a Mars mission, food must still be largely pre-supplied before launch. The real danger of this entire life support system is not that any single part will fail immediately, but that everything is connected in a tightly dependent chain. Oxygen production depends on water systems. Carbon dioxide removal depends on chemical processes. Water recycling depends on filtration systems. And food supply depends on storage stability. This creates what engineers call a failure chain problem, where the failure of one subsystem does not remain isolated, but begins to affect others, gradually increasing stress across the entire life support network. This is not just a theoretical concern, because there have already been warning cases on the International Space Station where partial system failures required emergency intervention and backup systems had to be activated to prevent serious risk to the crew. In those situations, astronauts were still relatively close to Earth and could receive support or resupply if needed. But even then, system failures created high-pressure situations where redundancy systems had to work immediately to prevent escalation. On a Mars mission, the same type of failure becomes far more serious because the ability to respond is extremely limited. There is no fast resupply, no quick repair mission, and no option to return to Earth within hours or days. Every system must be designed not only to function correctly, but to continue functioning for the entire duration of the mission without external support, which places enormous pressure on every component inside the spacecraft. Redundancy is often presented as the solution to this problem, meaning that critical systems are duplicated so that if one fails, another can take over. While this approach does improve safety, it does not eliminate risk completely, because redundancy systems themselves can fail, and multiple systems increase complexity, weight, and maintenance requirements. Over a 9-month journey, even small inefficiencies or unnoticed degradations can build into larger issues, and the longer the system runs without external maintenance, the more difficult it becomes to guarantee perfect reliability. This is why life support in a Mars-bound spacecraft is not simply a collection of machines, but a tightly interconnected survival environment where every subsystem depends on another, and where failure is not just a technical issue, but a direct threat to human survival. Even with advanced engineering, careful design, and multiple backup systems, the reality remains that sustaining human life in deep space requires every part of the system to work continuously and correctly for months in an environment where repair options are limited and external help does not exist. Entry, descent, and landing. The 7 minutes of death. When a spacecraft finally reaches Mars after months of travel, it does not arrive in a calm or controlled way, because there is no runway, no gradual approach, and no way to slow down gently like a plane entering an airport. Instead, the spacecraft hits the top of the Martian atmosphere at extremely high speed, and from that moment everything happens so fast that there is no room for human reaction, no real-time correction from Earth, and no possibility of pausing the sequence once it begins. This final stage, known as entry, descent, and landing, is often described as 7 minutes of complete dependence on automation, because the distance between Earth and Mars makes live control impossible, and every decision must already be programmed into the spacecraft before it even arrives. The first challenge comes from the atmosphere itself, or more accurately, the lack of it compared to Earth. On Earth, the atmosphere is thick enough to slow down incoming objects gradually, spreading heat and friction over a longer period so that spacecraft can survive re-entry using heat shields and controlled descent systems. Mars is completely different because its atmosphere is only about 1% the density of Earth's. That means there is not enough air to slow a spacecraft down in a smooth and controlled way. But there is still enough atmosphere to create extreme heat and instability when a fast-moving object enters it at interplanetary speed. This creates a very specific problem. If the atmosphere were thicker, like Earth's, parachutes and aerodynamic drag could be used effectively to slow down the spacecraft. If the atmosphere were almost non-existent, like in deep space, landing would rely purely on engines. But Mars sits in between these two conditions in a way that makes both approaches difficult. The thin atmosphere is not strong enough to slow a heavy crewed spacecraft on its own, which means parachutes cannot do the full job, but it is also thick enough to generate intense heat and pressure during entry, which means the spacecraft must survive a violent heating phase before it can even begin controlled descent. As the spacecraft enters the upper layers of the Martian atmosphere, it is still traveling at speeds of several kilometers per second, and at that velocity, the air in front of the vehicle compresses rapidly, creating extreme temperatures on the surface of the heat shield. This is not simple friction in the normal sense, but a combination of compression and energy transfer that turns the surrounding air into a superheated plasma. The heat shield must absorb and deflect this energy while keeping the interior of the spacecraft stable, because even a small failure in thermal protection at this stage would result in immediate structural damage. The heat shield is one of the most critical components of the entire landing system and it must be designed to survive peak heating conditions that last only a short time but reach extremely high intensity. The challenge is that it must be strong enough to protect the spacecraft during entry, but also light enough to be launched from Earth in the first place, and this balance between strength and weight is one of the key constraints in designing Mars landing systems. If the shield is too thin, it fails under heat stress, but if it is too heavy, it becomes impossible to accelerate the spacecraft efficiently over interplanetary distances. After surviving the initial entry heating phase, the spacecraft begins to slow down slightly, but it is still moving far too fast for parachutes or landing legs to handle safely. On Earth, large spacecraft can rely on parachutes alone to reduce speed significantly before landing. But on Mars, the atmosphere is too thin to generate enough drag force to slow down a heavy vehicle to safe speeds. This means parachutes can only handle part of the deceleration process. And even the largest parachutes ever designed for Mars missions have limits that fall far short of what is required for human-scale landers. Because of this limitation, engineers have had to consider more advanced and still partially experimental methods of slowing down spacecraft during descent. And one of the most important of these is supersonic retropropulsion. This method involves firing rocket engines while the spacecraft is still traveling at supersonic speeds through the Martian atmosphere, using controlled thrust to slow the vehicle down while it is still in the middle of atmospheric entry. This approach is extremely difficult because it requires precise control of engine thrust, stability in thin and turbulent air, and the ability to manage heat, vibration, and aerodynamic forces all at the same time. The main challenge with supersonic retropropulsion is that it has not yet been fully proven at the scale required for human missions. While it has been tested in limited forms and simulations, the conditions of a full-scale crewed landing system are much more complex, especially when combined with the mass of a human habitat, life support systems, and supplies needed for survival on the surface. The spacecraft must remain stable while firing engines in an environment where aerodynamic forces are still significant, and even small miscalculations in timing or thrust can lead to large deviations in trajectory or landing position. As the spacecraft continues its descent, another major limitation becomes even more critical, and that is communication delay. During entry, descent, and landing, there is no way for mission control on Earth to intervene in real time, because signals take several minutes to travel between planets. By the time a signal from Earth reaches the spacecraft, the landing sequence will already be over, which means the entire process must be fully autonomous. Every adjustment, every correction, and every decision must be handled by onboard systems that cannot rely on human input from Earth once the descent begins. This lack of real-time control creates a situation where even small errors in pre-programmed instructions can lead to catastrophic outcomes, because there is no opportunity for human operators to step in and correct the trajectory. The spacecraft must interpret sensor data, adjust engine thrust, manage orientation, and select landing zones all on its own within a very short time window, while also dealing with changing atmospheric conditions and unpredictable environmental factors on Mars. History shows how fragile this process already is, even for robotic missions. One of the most well-known failures is the Mars Climate Orbiter, where a simple navigation error caused by a mismatch in measurement units led to the loss of the spacecraft during arrival at Mars. Instead of entering a stable orbit, the spacecraft came too close to the planet and was destroyed in the atmosphere. This failure did not come from a lack of technology, but from a small coordination error that became critical during a high-speed planetary approach, showing how little margin for error exists in Mars navigation. Another example is the Schiaparelli EDM lander in 2016, which was part of a European mission designed to test landing technologies for Mars. During its descent, the lander experienced incorrect data interpretation that caused its systems to believe it had already landed when it was still in the air. As a result, the engines shut down prematurely and the spacecraft crashed into the surface at high speed. This failure highlighted how even advanced automated systems can misinterpret data during the most critical phase of landing, where timing and accuracy must be perfect within a very narrow window. These examples are important because they show that even unmanned missions, which are lighter, simpler, and more flexible than crewed spacecraft, still face significant risks during entry, descent, and landing. When you scale this up to a human mission, the complexity increases dramatically, because the spacecraft is not only carrying scientific instruments, but also life support systems, habitat structures, and all the resources needed to sustain human life after landing. At this stage, the probability of catastrophic landing failure remains a serious concern, even with modern technology. The combination of thin atmosphere, extreme entry speeds, limited real-time control, and complex engineering requirements creates a situation where every landing attempt carries inherent risk. Unlike Earth, where multiple layers of atmosphere, human control, and established infrastructure reduce landing danger, Mars offers no such safety net. Every descent is a fully independent sequence that must succeed perfectly under conditions that leave almost no room for recovery once errors begin. This is why entry, descent, and landing on Mars is often described as one of the most dangerous phases of any space mission ever attempted, not because it is impossible, but because it operates at the very edge of current engineering capability, where success depends on precision, timing, and systems that must perform flawlessly in an environment that is still not fully understood at human scale. Mars' surface environment, a planet that doesn't want you there. When a spacecraft finally survives the long journey through deep space and manages to land on Mars, it does not arrive on a welcoming surface or a place that slowly adapts to human life. It arrives on a planet that is fundamentally hostile to the way the human body works. And the moment the landing sequence ends, survival becomes dependent on systems that must replace every natural condition Earth normally provides without effort. There is no breathable air, no stable climate, and no natural protection from radiation, and everything that allows humans to stay alive must be carried, built, or continuously maintained in an environment that actively works against long-term human presence. The first and most immediate problem is the atmosphere itself, because the air on Mars is not just thin, it is almost completely unsuitable for human breathing. The atmosphere is made up of about 95% carbon dioxide, which means that even if a person could somehow breathe without a suit, there is almost no oxygen available to support human life. On Earth, oxygen is constantly replenished by plants and atmospheric processes, but on Mars, the near absence of oxygen means the environment itself cannot support even short-term exposure without artificial life support systems. The human body cannot function in this atmosphere because it is not just lacking oxygen, it is actively filled with a gas that humans cannot use for respiration, making unprotected exposure immediately dangerous. Beyond the composition of the air, the atmospheric pressure on Mars creates an even more direct survival problem, because it is only about 0.6% of Earth's surface pressure. This is not a small reduction in comfort or breathing efficiency. It is a level so low that human bodily fluids would not remain stable without a pressurized suit. At this pressure, the human body is exposed to conditions where water in tissues can begin to behave unpredictably, and the lungs cannot function properly because there is not enough external pressure to support normal breathing mechanics. Even short exposure without a suit would be immediately life-threatening, not because of temperature or radiation at first, but because the environment itself cannot hold the body in a stable, biological state. This low-pressure environment also means that Mars cannot support any kind of breathable atmosphere naturally, because gases do not remain dense enough to create a stable layer like Earth's atmosphere. Instead, the air is so thin that it behaves almost like a vacuum in many situations, reducing its ability to distribute heat or block radiation. This creates a surface environment where survival is not just about breathing, but about maintaining a sealed system around the body at all times, because the planet itself does not provide even the most basic atmospheric support needed for human biology. Temperature is another major factor that makes the Martian surface difficult for human survival, because it is not stable or predictable in a way that allows simple adaptation. The surface temperature can drop as low as -125 degrees Celsius during the coldest conditions, especially near the poles or during the night, while in some equatorial regions and under direct sunlight, it can rise to around 20 degrees Celsius for short periods. This wide range means that the environment is not consistently cold or warm, but constantly shifting between extremes that require constant thermal control from any life support system. These temperature swings are especially dangerous because they occur in an atmosphere that cannot hold or distribute heat effectively. On Earth, the atmosphere helps moderate temperature changes by storing and moving heat across regions. But on Mars, the thin atmosphere cannot perform this function, which means heat from the sun can create short periods of relative warmth, while the absence of that heat at night leads to rapid and extreme cooling. This creates a surface environment where temperature is controlled more by direct exposure conditions than by any stable atmospheric system, forcing any human habitat to rely entirely on internal thermal regulation to remain livable. When you combine atmospheric composition, extremely low pressure, and wide temperature extremes, the result is a surface environment that is not just harsh, but fundamentally incompatible with unprotected human life. Every aspect of the air and temperature conditions on Mars requires artificial control systems to maintain even basic survivability, because there is no natural baseline that supports human biology. Unlike Earth, where the atmosphere and climate provide a stable background for life to exist, Mars requires humans to carry their own environment with them at all times, sealed inside suits or habitats that must function without interruption. Dust storms and toxic regolith. Once humans step onto the surface of Mars, the environment does not settle into something stable or predictable, because even after surviving landing and adjusting to the thin atmosphere, the planet continues to change in ways that directly affect survival systems, energy production, and even the safety of the ground itself. One of the most visually dramatic and operationally dangerous features of Mars is its dust storm system, which is not like weather on Earth, but a planet-wide atmospheric event that can spread across thousands of kilometers and completely change surface conditions in a very short time. Mars dust storms can grow from local events into massive global systems that cover the entire planet, reducing sunlight, changing temperature patterns, and filling the atmosphere with fine particles that remain suspended for long periods. Unlike Earth storms, which are driven by water cycles and dense atmospheric movement, Mars storms are driven by wind acting on extremely fine dust in a very thin atmosphere, which allows particles to stay airborne and travel across vast distances without quickly settling. When these storms expand to global scale, they do not just create visibility problems, they alter the entire energy balance on the surface, because sunlight is blocked before it can reach solar panels or surface equipment. This becomes a direct survival issue for any human base on Mars, because most mission designs rely heavily on solar power as a primary energy source. When a dust storm spreads across the planet, the amount of sunlight reaching the surface can drop significantly, which means solar panels begin to lose efficiency or fail to produce enough energy to support life support systems, heating systems, communication systems, and other critical infrastructure. Unlike Earth, where storms pass relatively quickly and sunlight returns in a predictable cycle, Mars storms can last for extended periods, and during that time energy production becomes unstable, forcing any habitat to rely on stored power systems that have limited capacity. The danger is not only the loss of energy, but the unpredictability of how quickly these storms can grow and how widely they can spread. A mission on the surface may begin under clear skies with stable power generation, and within a short time, the entire region can be affected by dust coverage that reduces efficiency across all exposed systems. This creates a situation where energy planning must account not only for average conditions, but for worst-case scenarios where sunlight may be reduced for days or even longer, placing continuous stress on stored energy reserves and backup systems. Beyond the operational risks, the Martian surface itself presents another hidden but equally serious challenge, which is the nature of the soil, known as regolith. At first glance, the surface appears to be dry dust and rocky material, but chemical analysis has shown that this regolith contains compounds that are toxic to humans, especially perchlorates, which are highly reactive chemicals that do not exist in the same concentrations in most natural Earth soils. These perchlorates are dangerous because they can interfere with human thyroid function and pose risks if they enter the body through dust exposure, contamination, or long-term environmental contact inside habitats. The presence of toxic regolith means that even basic activities like walking on the surface, collecting samples, or constructing habitats must be carefully controlled to prevent contamination from spreading into living areas. Dust on Mars is extremely fine, which means it can easily cling to equipment, suits, and surfaces. And once it enters a sealed habitat, it becomes a persistent contamination risk that must be actively managed. Unlike Earth soil, which is biologically balanced and relatively safe to handle in most conditions, Martian soil requires constant caution because its chemical composition is not naturally compatible with human biology. This creates a situation where the surface environment is not only hostile in terms of atmosphere and temperature, but also chemically active in a way that makes long-term exposure dangerous even in controlled environments. Every interaction with the ground carries a risk of bringing harmful materials back into living spaces, which means that habitat design must include strict separation systems, cleaning protocols, and containment strategies to prevent toxic dust from accumulating inside crew environments. Gravity, water stability, and radiation exposure. Even after surviving the atmosphere, dust storms, and toxic soil, the Martian surface still presents deeper, long-term problems that are less visible at first, but become more important the longer humans stay on the planet, because Mars does not just challenge short-term survival, it changes the basic conditions that human biology depends on over time in ways that are still not fully understood. One of the most important of these conditions is gravity, which on Mars is only about 38% of Earth's gravity. And this difference seems simple at first, but has complex effects on the human body when exposure continues for long periods. On Earth, the human body evolved under constant gravity that affects every system, from how muscles develop to how bones maintain strength and how blood circulates through the body. When this force is reduced to less than half of what the body is used to, the internal systems begin to adjust in ways that are still not fully predictable for long-term exposure. Short-term space missions in microgravity have already shown that the body begins to lose muscle mass and bone density when gravity is reduced, but Mars presents a different situation because it is not zero gravity, but partial gravity, which creates a condition that has never been experienced over years of continuous living by humans. This partial gravity raises a critical question that science still cannot fully answer, which is whether 38% of Earth's gravity is enough to maintain long-term human health without gradual decline in muscle strength, bone density, cardiovascular stability and overall physical resilience. In low Earth orbit, astronauts experience near weightless conditions and must exercise constantly to slow down physical degradation. But on Mars, the body is still under some gravitational load, which might reduce some of these effects, or it might create a new type of slow adaptation that could still lead to long-term health changes that are not yet fully measured or understood. Alongside gravity concerns, another major limitation of the Martian environment is the absence of stable liquid water on the surface under normal conditions. On Earth, liquid water exists because atmospheric pressure and temperature ranges allow it to remain stable in rivers, lakes, and oceans. But on Mars, the low atmospheric pressure makes it extremely difficult for liquid water to exist naturally on the surface for extended periods. If water does appear, it tends to either freeze quickly due to low temperatures or evaporate or sublimate into the thin atmosphere because the pressure is too low to maintain stable liquid form. This means that even though water ice exists on Mars and there are signs of subsurface water in some regions, the surface environment itself does not support stable liquid water in a way that can be easily used for agriculture, long-term open systems, or natural ecosystem development. Any human mission must therefore rely on controlled water systems that are fully enclosed and carefully managed, because the planet does not provide surface conditions that allow water to behave in a stable and predictable way for daily use. The absence of stable liquid water also limits how naturally life-supporting systems could expand on Mars, because on Earth, water cycles play a central role in sustaining ecosystems, regulating temperature, and supporting biological processes. On Mars, this cycle does not exist in a natural form on the surface, which means every water-related process must be artificially controlled inside habitats, without relying on environmental support from the planet itself. Beyond gravity and water limitations, one of the most important long-term environmental factors on Mars is the lack of a global magnetic field, which on Earth plays a critical role in protecting the surface from constant exposure to charged particles coming from space and from the Sun. Without a strong magnetic field, Mars has no large-scale shield to deflect incoming radiation, which means that the surface is continuously exposed to high-energy particles that pass through space and reach the ground almost directly. This constant radiation bombardment creates a surface environment where exposure is always present, even during calm conditions, with no storms or visible activity. Unlike Earth, where the magnetic field and atmosphere work together to reduce radiation levels at the surface, Mars offers very little natural protection, which means that any long-term human presence must rely entirely on artificial shielding provided by habitats, underground structures, or protective materials built specifically to block or reduce radiation exposure. The combination of weak gravity, unstable surface water conditions, and continuous radiation exposure creates a layered environment where each factor reinforces the others in limiting long-term human survival. Gravity affects the body internally over time. Water instability limits environmental development and resource use, and radiation continuously affects both the surface and any exposed systems. Together, these conditions show that Mars is not just a dry or cold planet, but a place where multiple fundamental systems that support life on Earth are missing or weakened at the same time, forcing humans to rely entirely on engineered protection for every aspect of survival. Habitats, the illusion of safety. When humans finally reach Mars and step out of their landing craft, the first real sense of safety does not come from the planet itself, but from the habitats they bring with them, because survival on the surface depends entirely on sealed structures that must replace Earth's atmosphere, pressure, temperature control, and protection from radiation all at once. These habitats are often described as homes, but in reality, They are more like tightly controlled machines that must function perfectly every second, because there is no natural environment outside that can support human life even for a short moment. The moment a habitat loses pressure, or air begins to leak, or temperature control fails, the difference between safety and danger is measured in minutes, not hours. One of the main design ideas for Mars habitats is the use of inflatable structures, which are lightweight during transport and can be expanded once they reach the surface. These habitats are packed tightly during launch and then filled with air to create larger living spaces once deployed, which makes them efficient in terms of cargo weight and internal volume. On the surface, this approach allows engineers to create more living space without sending massive rigid structures from Earth, which would require far more fuel and launch capacity. However, the very design that makes inflatable habitats useful also introduces a serious vulnerability, because the walls of these structures must remain under constant pressure to keep their shape and integrity, and any damage to the outer layer can immediately threaten the entire internal environment. Rigid module habitats are another approach, built from solid materials that resemble spacecraft sections used in orbital stations. And while they provide stronger structural protection compared to inflatable designs, they are still limited by the same fundamental issue, which is that they must maintain a sealed environment against a planet that is actively trying to break that seal. Mars presents a continuous risk of micrometeorite impacts, which are small particles moving at extremely high speeds that can strike habitat surfaces with enough energy to damage outer layers over time. Even if each individual impact is small, repeated exposure creates a long-term risk of weakening structural integrity. And since habitats cannot be easily replaced or repaired from Earth, every layer of protection becomes critical for long-term survival. Inside these habitats, pressure management becomes one of the most important systems, because human life depends on maintaining a stable internal atmosphere that is completely different from the outside environment. The air inside must remain at a safe pressure level, with carefully controlled oxygen and carbon dioxide balance. And even a small leak can slowly reduce pressure over time if not detected quickly. Airlock systems are used to allow astronauts to enter and exit the habitat while minimizing air loss. But these systems themselves become critical points of failure because every airlock cycle introduces mechanical stress, potential contamination, and pressure changes that must be carefully controlled. If an airlock system fails, the consequences can be immediate and severe because it is the main barrier between the inside environment and the outside Martian surface. A failure during entry or exit could lead to rapid decompression or contamination of the habitat interior, and unlike Earth, there is no external rescue system that can respond quickly to stabilize the situation. Every airlock must therefore operate with extreme reliability and must also include multiple safety layers to prevent accidental exposure to the outside environment. But even with redundancy, the system remains one of the most sensitive points in the entire habitat design. Temperature control inside Mars habitats is another constant challenge because the external environment is not stable and can swing between extreme cold and relatively mild conditions, depending on location and time of day. The habitat must maintain a stable internal temperature regardless of external fluctuations, which requires continuous energy use for heating and cooling systems. Unlike Earth, where atmospheric conditions help regulate temperature naturally, Mars provides no such support. So all thermal regulation must be handled internally through mechanical systems that must operate without interruption for months or years at a time. Dust infiltration adds another layer of complexity to habitat safety, because Martian dust is extremely fine and can easily cling to surfaces, equipment, and spacesuits. And once it enters a habitat, it becomes very difficult to remove completely. This dust is not just a cleaning problem, but also a mechanical and health risk, because it can interfere with moving parts in equipment, clog filters, and create long-term contamination inside living spaces. When brought inside on suits or equipment, it can slowly spread through the habitat environment, affecting air quality and requiring constant filtration and cleaning systems to manage exposure levels. The respiratory risk from dust is especially important because continuous exposure inside a sealed environment can affect air quality over time, and any failure in filtration systems could lead to buildup of fine particles in the breathing environment. Since habitats are fully closed systems, there is no natural air exchange to remove contaminants, which means everything that enters must be actively filtered, captured, or neutralized. This makes dust control not a secondary issue, but a constant operational requirement that affects daily routines, maintenance schedules, and even how astronauts move between inside and outside environments. Maintenance becomes one of the most critical aspects of habitat survival because every system inside a Mars base must be repaired manually, often by the same crew that depends on those systems for survival. There is no external technical support arriving within hours or days, and no large supply chain that can quickly replace broken components, which means astronauts must act as operators, engineers, and repair technicians at the same time. Every system, from air circulation to water recycling to power distribution, requires ongoing inspection and maintenance to prevent small issues from turning into system-wide failures. This creates a situation where single-point failures become extremely dangerous, because even a small malfunction in a critical system can escalate quickly if it is not repaired immediately. On Earth, backup systems and emergency response teams can handle such failures quickly, but on Mars, the delay in external assistance means that internal redundancy must handle every possible failure scenario. However, redundancy itself does not fully solve the problem, because adding more backup systems increases complexity, requires more maintenance, and introduces additional points where failure can still occur. As the system becomes more complex, the ability to maintain perfect reliability becomes more difficult, especially over long durations, where wear and tear gradually affect all components. Even small degradation in seals, filters, or mechanical parts can slowly reduce overall system performance. And since everything is interconnected inside the habitat, a failure in one subsystem can begin to affect others over time. This is why engineers describe Mars habitats not as static shelters, but as living systems that must be constantly monitored and maintained to prevent cascading failures. Medical emergencies. No hospital, no evacuation. A Mars mission changes the meaning of medical care completely, because the moment a crew leaves Earth, they also leave behind every safety system that normally supports human survival during illness or injury. There is no hospital, no ambulance, no emergency surgery team waiting on call, and no possibility of quick evacuation if something goes wrong inside the body. Everything that would normally be handled within minutes on Earth becomes something that must be managed inside a small sealed habitat, where tools are limited, training is partial, and the crew itself becomes the entire medical system for months at a time. Appendicitis is one of the clearest examples of how dangerous this becomes in practice, because it is a condition that often appears suddenly and progresses in a way that requires surgical treatment within a limited time window. On Earth, this is routine. The patient is transported quickly, scanned, diagnosed, and taken into surgery with a full medical team ready to respond to complications. On Mars, none of that exists. The crew cannot return to Earth, cannot call in specialists to arrive, and cannot delay treatment until conditions improve. If it happens during the mission, the decision is immediate and internal, and the procedure must be carried out in whatever medical setup is available inside the habitat, which was never designed to function as a full hospital environment. Trauma is even more direct in its consequences because injuries from equipment failure falls inside the habitat or accidents during surface work can lead to bleeding, fractures, or internal damage that would normally require advanced imaging, surgical intervention, and post-operative care in a hospital setting. In a Mars environment, the response has to happen entirely on site, and the crew must stabilise the patient using limited medical kits and whatever training they have received before the mission. There is no option to wait for evacuation or specialised care, because evacuation simply does not exist at that distance. And even communication delays mean that real-time guidance from Earth is limited. Infections create a slower but equally serious risk, because even small wounds can become dangerous when medical resources are limited and conditions are tightly controlled inside a closed habitat. On Earth, infections are usually managed with a wide range of antibiotics and rapid medical escalation if conditions worsen. But on a Mars mission, the supply of medication is fixed before launch and cannot be replaced. This means every treatment decision depends on what is already available on board. And if an infection does not respond to the first line of treatment, options become limited quickly. The situation becomes even more complex because the immune system itself can behave differently in space conditions, which means recovery may not follow the same pattern as it would on Earth. Surgery in reduced gravity adds another layer of difficulty that is not fully resolved in current space medicine. Human anatomy and surgical techniques were developed under Earth gravity, where fluids behave predictably and surgeons rely on stable positioning and controlled environments. In Mars gravity, which is lower than Earth but not zero, fluid behavior changes in ways that still require adaptation, and maintaining a sterile surgical field becomes more complicated inside a confined habitat. Even basic procedures demand careful control of movement, pressure, and contamination, and more complex surgeries become extremely high risk simply because the environment does not support traditional medical practice. Medication itself becomes a long-term concern because drugs are not designed to remain fully stable over the duration of a Mars mission. Exposure to radiation, temperature changes, and long storage times can reduce the effectiveness of pharmaceuticals, which means that some medications may lose potency before they are needed most. This creates a hidden risk where supplies that appear sufficient at the start of the mission may not perform as expected later on, especially during emergencies where precise dosage and reliability are critical. Radiation exposure also contributes to medical risk in a way that builds over time rather than appearing immediately. During solar events or long-term deep space travel, radiation can affect human tissue at the cellular level, increasing the chance of illness and complicating recovery from injuries or infections. Treatment options for radiation-related conditions are extremely limited in a spacecraft environment because there is no access to advanced hospital equipment, specialized care units, or long-term recovery facilities. The focus becomes stabilization rather than full treatment, which is a major shift from how medicine normally functions on Earth. Mental health is another major part of medical stability during a Mars mission, because isolation, confinement, and constant operational pressure create conditions that can gradually affect mood, decision-making, and overall psychological resilience. The crew lives in a closed environment for months, with the same people, the same routines, and no physical separation from stress factors. Over time, this can lead to fatigue, tension, or reduced cognitive performance, which in a medical emergency becomes even more serious because decision-making speed and clarity are critical when treating injuries or managing illness. The structure of the crew makes this even more sensitive because medical responsibility usually falls on one primary medical officer, supported by general training across the rest of the team. This creates a situation where a single person must handle a wide range of medical problems, from minor injuries to life-threatening emergencies, often without specialist backup. If that person becomes overwhelmed, or if multiple medical issues occur at the same time, the entire system is stretched beyond what it was originally designed to handle. NASA analog missions on Earth provide some insight into how isolated crews respond to medical stress, but these environments still operate with important safety differences. Communication with Earth is faster. Physical evacuation is possible in extreme cases, and external medical support can still intervene if needed. On Mars, those safety layers disappear completely, and the crew must operate under conditions where every medical decision is final and cannot be corrected by outside assistance. What makes all of this more serious is that medical emergencies on Mars do not happen in isolation from other risks. They occur in an environment where radiation is constant, life support is fully mechanical, and physical recovery conditions are limited. This means that every illness or injury is influenced by the surrounding environment, and every treatment is shaped by the reality that there is no backup system waiting beyond the habitat walls. The communication gap, humanity cut off. Communication between Earth and Mars does not fail in the usual sense, where signals stop completely. Instead, it slows down in a way that changes how every decision is made, every emergency is handled, and every moment of uncertainty is experienced by the crew, because the simple act of talking to mission control becomes delayed by minutes that cannot be reduced, removed, or bypassed. Depending on the position of Earth and Mars in their orbits, a message can take anywhere from about 4 minutes to as long as 24 minutes to travel in one direction, which means a full conversation can stretch into nearly an hour before both sides hear and respond to each other in full. This is not a technical inconvenience, it is a structural limitation of distance itself, and it fundamentally changes how humans operate in real time during a crisis. On Earth, communication during emergencies is built around immediacy, where doctors, engineers, and mission controllers can respond instantly to new information, adjust decisions in real time, and guide operations step by step as events unfold. On a Mars mission, that structure collapses, because by the time a question reaches Earth, the situation that caused it may already have changed, and by the time the answer returns, the crew may already be deep into a different stage of the problem. This creates a constant delay loop where no one is truly operating in the same moment, and every instruction is always slightly behind reality. In normal operations, this delay is manageable because spacecraft systems are designed with pre-planned procedures that allow astronauts to continue working without waiting for instructions. Routine tasks, maintenance, and scheduled operations are all structured in advance so that the crew can function independently for long periods of time. The real problem begins during unexpected events, because emergencies do not follow pre-written scripts, and every delay in communication removes the possibility of real-time correction from Earth-based experts who normally guide critical decisions in space missions close to Earth. This is where autonomous systems become essential, because spacecraft and habitats must be able to respond to changes in environment, system performance, and internal conditions without waiting for human input from Earth. Modern spacecraft already use automated systems for navigation, life support monitoring, and descent control. But these systems are still limited in how much complexity they can handle without human oversight. They are designed to follow predefined rules and respond to known scenarios, but deep space introduces conditions where multiple unexpected variables can occur at the same time, which pushes automation beyond its original design limits. Artificial intelligence and advanced automation are being developed to support these systems, but current technology still operates within narrow boundaries compared to the full range of decisions made by trained human operators. AI can monitor data, detect anomalies, and suggest responses, but it does not yet replace the full judgment required during unpredictable emergencies, especially when multiple systems begin to fail at once, or when environmental conditions change in ways that were not fully anticipated during mission planning. This means that even with AI assistance, the crew remains the final decision-making authority, and that responsibility becomes heavier when communication with Earth is delayed. During emergency situations, this delay creates a very specific type of risk where miscoordination can occur between Earth and the spacecraft. A situation might begin on Mars where a system begins to fail and the crew sends a request for guidance, but by the time Earth receives the message and prepares a response, the system status may have already changed, leading to instructions that are no longer fully relevant. If the crew then acts on outdated guidance, or if Earth continues to adjust recommendations based on old data, the response chain can become misaligned with the actual situation unfolding in real time. This kind of miscoordination is not caused by lack of expertise, but by the simple fact that both sides are working on different timelines. Earth is always reacting to information that is already minutes old, while the crew is dealing with conditions that are changing in real time. In critical systems such as life support, navigation, or medical emergencies, even small timing differences can affect outcomes, and the inability to synchronize decisions creates a layer of uncertainty that does not exist in near-Earth missions. The psychological effect of this communication gap is also significant, because human beings are naturally used to immediate feedback during stress or crisis situations. On Earth, support systems are always available in real time, whether through direct communication, physical assistance, or emergency response teams that can intervene quickly. In a Mars mission, that immediate connection disappears, and the crew is left with the knowledge that any request for help will not receive an instant response, even if the response itself is technically correct. This delay changes how emergencies feel at a human level, because in moments of high stress, waiting becomes part of the experience of the crisis itself. A simple question, a request for confirmation, or a need for reassurance all enter a delayed loop where silence is not absence of response, but a built-in feature of the communication system. Over time, this can affect how crew members process pressure, because they must make decisions without the emotional support of immediate external validation. Even outside of emergencies, the delay shapes daily interaction between the crew and Earth in subtle ways. Conversations with family, updates from mission control, and routine check-ins all become asynchronous, which means emotional exchange is no longer continuous. A message sent from Earth may arrive long after the moment it was intended to provide comfort or support, and by the time a response is sent back, the original emotional context may have already changed. This creates a disconnect where communication still exists, but it no longer functions as real-time interaction. Inside the spacecraft, this reinforces a sense of operational isolation, because the crew cannot rely on Earth as a constantly available support system in the way humans normally do in stressful environments. Instead, Earth becomes a delayed advisory system, where guidance is valuable but not immediate, and where final decisions must always be made locally, regardless of outside input. This places a continuous cognitive load on the crew, because they must operate with full awareness that no external intervention can arrive in time to change an urgent situation. As missions become more complex, this dependency on delayed communication combined with partial autonomy creates a new operational model for human spaceflight, where crews must be trained not only to perform tasks, but to interpret incomplete information, make independent decisions under pressure, and manage uncertainty without immediate confirmation. This is fundamentally different from traditional mission control structures used in low Earth orbit, where real-time communication still allows for close guidance and rapid correction of problems. Return problem. Getting off Mars is harder than landing. Getting to Mars is often described as the hardest part of the mission, But once you actually think through what happens after landing, a different problem appears, because the spacecraft that brought the crew there cannot simply turn around and return them home. It has already used most of its fuel during the journey, and it was never designed to carry enough propellant for a full round trip from Earth to Mars and back again. This means that once the crew is on the surface, survival depends on a completely separate system that must be built or prepared on Mars itself, and that system has to work perfectly before any return attempt can even begin. The main idea behind returning from Mars is a vehicle called a Mars Ascent System, which is essentially a small rocket designed to lift astronauts off the surface and send them back into orbit, where another spacecraft would take them home. Unlike Earth, where rockets can be tested, repaired, and relaunched with support infrastructure, a Mars Ascent vehicle must work on its first real use, in an environment where there is no maintenance team, no repair facility, and no backup launch system ready to replace it if something goes wrong. Everything depends on that single launch working correctly, because there is no second chance in the same mission cycle. Fuel becomes the central challenge of this entire return system, because bringing all required propellant from Earth would make the mission extremely heavy and impractical. Instead, mission designs rely heavily on in situ resource utilization, which means producing fuel directly on Mars using local resources. The most important resource for this process is the Martian atmosphere, which is mostly carbon dioxide, and this gas can be processed to extract oxygen, which is a key component of rocket fuel. Experiments like NASA's MOXIE system on the Perseverance rover have already demonstrated small-scale oxygen production from carbon dioxide, showing that it is possible in principle to generate breathable or usable oxygen on Mars. However, scaling this process from a small experimental device to a full fuel production system for a human return mission introduces major engineering challenges. Producing oxygen for life support is one thing, but producing large quantities of high-purity oxygen for rocket propulsion requires continuous, reliable operation over long periods of time. The system must extract carbon dioxide, convert it into oxygen efficiently, store it safely, and combine it with a fuel source such as methane, all while operating in a harsh environment with dust, temperature extremes, and limited maintenance capability. Any interruption in this process can delay or completely compromise the ability to launch the return vehicle. Fuel instability adds another layer of risk, because rocket propellants must be stored under controlled conditions until the moment of launch. On Mars, temperature fluctuations and environmental stress can affect storage systems, seals, and pressure stability, which means the fuel that is produced must remain reliable over time without degradation. If fuel quality is reduced or storage systems fail, the ascent vehicle may not generate enough thrust to escape Mars gravity, which is already a significant challenge, even with full performance. Timing is another strict limitation because missions to Mars are bound by orbital mechanics that only allow efficient travel between Earth and Mars during specific launch windows that occur roughly every 26 months. This means that if a return opportunity is missed due to technical failure, delay, or system malfunction, the crew may have to wait for the next available alignment, which is not a short delay, but a multi-year extension of the mission. During that time, life support systems, supplies, and equipment must continue functioning far beyond their planned duration, creating additional strain on every subsystem inside the mission architecture. If the ascent vehicle fails completely, the situation becomes permanent entrapment because there is no practical way to send a rescue mission quickly enough to change the outcome. Unlike Earth orbit missions, where emergency rescue is at least theoretically possible within hours or days, Mars is separated by such a large distance that rescue missions would take months to arrive, and by that time, the situation on the surface would already be irreversible. This makes the ascent phase one of the highest risk points in the entire mission, because it represents the only path back to Earth. Even if the ascent from Mars succeeds and the crew reaches orbit, the return journey still carries significant risk because Earth re-entry is another high-energy event that must be survived with extreme precision. The spacecraft must enter Earth's atmosphere at the correct angle and speed, because even small deviations can result in burning up in the atmosphere or skipping off into space. This final stage is similar in intensity to Mars landing, but in reverse, and it must be executed perfectly after months or years of exposure to space conditions, fatigue, and system wear. System failure. Cascade: how one small error kills everyone. A Mars mission is not a single system working in isolation. It is a tightly connected chain of system where every part depends on the others, and this creates a situation where small failures do not stay small for long. Instead, they spread through the system in a chain reaction where one issue leads to another, and each step increases the difficulty of recovery until the entire mission becomes unstable. Engineers refer to this as failure cascade behavior, where multiple subsystems begin to interact in ways that amplify risk rather than contain it. In real mission design models, this cascade effect is studied through simulated failure chains, where engineers test how one system breakdown affects others. For example, a sensor failure might seem minor at first, but if that sensor is part of a navigation system, it can produce incorrect data that leads the spacecraft off course. That navigation error can then affect fuel consumption during correction maneuvers, which reduces available reserves for later phases of the mission, and in extreme cases, it can push the spacecraft into an incorrect landing trajectory where recovery is no longer possible. What begins as a small hardware issue can eventually become a full mission failure simply through a chain of connected dependencies. Life support systems follow a similar pattern, where an air leak may not immediately threaten the entire crew, but over time it reduces oxygen levels, increases stress on recycling systems, and forces emergency compensation from backup systems. If the leak is not detected quickly, oxygen reserves can drop, carbon dioxide levels can rise, and crew performance can begin to decline due to reduced air quality. As performance declines, decision-making becomes less effective, which increases the chance of further mistakes in handling the system, creating a feedback loop where human response and mechanical failure begin to reinforce each other. This is why Mars missions do not have a true safe fallback mode in the way Earth systems often do. On Earth, when a system fails, there is usually an external support structure that can intervene, repair, or replace damaged components quickly. In low Earth orbit, astronauts can still return to Earth in emergencies, and mission control can respond in near real time. On Mars, none of these options exist. Every system must be self-sustaining, every repair must be internal, and every failure must be managed within the mission itself without expecting outside intervention. The real danger comes from probabilistic stacking of risks, where each subsystem has a small chance of failure. But when many subsystems are combined in one mission, those small probabilities begin to add up. Life support, propulsion, navigation, communication, thermal control, radiation shielding, and structural integrity all have their own failure risks. And when these are layered together over long mission durations, the overall probability of something going wrong increases even if each individual system is highly reliable on its own. The longer the mission lasts, the more opportunities there are for small issues to appear, and the more time there is for those issues to combine into larger failures. This is not a dramatic or sudden collapse scenario, but a gradual build-up of pressure inside a tightly connected system where everything depends on everything else. A small leak becomes a resource problem. A resource problem becomes a performance problem. A performance problem becomes a decision-making problem. And by the time the chain is fully visible, there may no longer be enough time or resources to reverse it. In this environment, failure is rarely caused by one dramatic event alone, but by a sequence of smaller issues that interact over time until the system can no longer compensate. This is what makes Mars missions fundamentally different from most other human engineering projects, because they operate in a condition where isolation removes external correction, time delays remove real-time support, and system interdependence turns small faults into potential mission-ending events. Every part of the mission must assume that no backup from outside will arrive in time, which means even minor weaknesses in design or execution can grow into critical points of failure under the right conditions. What current technology actually says, right now, the real story of Mars is not written in plans or announcements, but in what current technology can actually prove under real testing conditions. Because every serious program that looks at Mars eventually runs into the same gap between what is imagined and what can be reliably built, launched, and operated for years without outside support. NASA's Artemis program is often used as a stepping stone for deep space readiness, and while it focuses on returning humans to the Moon, the real purpose is to test systems that could one day survive farther missions, including life support, surface operations, and long-duration crew health management. What Artemis shows very clearly is that even returning to the Moon at a closer distance than Mars still requires completely new levels of system reliability. Because the moment humans leave low Earth orbit, the safety net of fast rescue and constant real-time support begins to disappear. The Artemis missions are designed to test how spacecraft behave when they are farther from Earth, where communication delays begin to matter, and where crews must operate with more independence than on the International Space Station. But even these missions are still within a range where emergency return is possible in days, not months, which means they are still fundamentally different from Mars missions. They help engineers understand deep space navigation, radiation exposure beyond Earth's magnetosphere, and surface operations in low-gravity environments. But they do not yet replicate the full isolation and long-term survival pressure of a Mars journey. At the same time, private space architecture proposals like SpaceX's Starship concept have reshaped how Mars missions are discussed, because the idea of fully reusable heavy-lift rockets and large cargo transport systems makes Mars missions look more physically possible in terms of launch capability. Starship is designed to carry large payloads, potentially multiple crew members, and significant cargo for surface operations, which is a major shift from earlier mission designs that focused on small crews and minimal equipment. However, even with this kind of system, the core challenges remain unchanged, because carrying more people or cargo does not solve radiation exposure, life support reliability over years, or the need for a fully independent surface infrastructure that must function without Earth-based repair support. Radiation shielding remains one of the most active areas of research, but current solutions are still experimental and not yet ready for full mission deployment. Engineers are testing different materials, including hydrogen-rich compounds, water-based shielding, and layered structural designs that could reduce exposure during transit and surface operations. But each approach comes with trade-offs in weight, cost, and structural complexity. The problem is that effective shielding against deep space radiation requires either very heavy materials or active protection systems that are not yet proven at scale, which means spacecraft must currently accept a level of exposure that is still considered medically risky for long-duration missions. Closed-loop life support systems are another critical area where progress has been made, but not fully completed. On the International Space Station, systems already recycle air and water to a high degree of efficiency, with water recycling reaching very high percentages and oxygen regeneration systems reducing dependence on resupply missions. However, these systems still rely on regular maintenance, replacement parts, and support from Earth, which makes them unsuitable for a Mars mission without major upgrades. Current testing shows that while closed-loop systems can function for extended periods, maintaining perfect stability over multi-year missions without external intervention is still not fully achieved. Nuclear propulsion is often discussed as a potential solution to reduce travel time to Mars, which would directly reduce radiation exposure and life support duration during transit. Concepts like nuclear thermal propulsion or nuclear electric propulsion could shorten the journey significantly compared to current chemical rockets. But these systems are still in early development stages and have not yet been demonstrated in full human-rated missions. Even if successful, they would reduce one major risk rather than eliminate the broader set of challenges, because landing, surface survival, and return operations would still depend on systems that must function independently on Mars itself. When all current technology is assessed together, the gap between readiness and requirement becomes very clear, because every major subsystem needed for a Mars mission exists in some form, but none of them exist at the level of reliability required for a full human mission without external rescue options. Radiation protection is partial, life support is dependent on maintenance, propulsion is still evolving, and surface systems have never been tested at the scale or duration needed for human survival on Mars. Final reality check: why death is the default. When all the individual risks are combined into a single mission profile, the overall picture changes from a set of solvable engineering problems into a system where multiple high-risk domains overlap at the same time. Radiation exposure affects long-term health during transit and surface stay. Life support systems depend on continuous mechanical function without interruption. Landing carries a high-risk entry phase with no real-time control. The surface environment introduces dust, cold, and chemical hazards. And medical isolation removes any possibility of external emergency care. Each of these systems has a manageable risk on its own. But on Mars, they do not operate separately. They operate together inside the same confined mission. This is where compounding risk becomes the central issue, because failure does not need to come from one catastrophic event. Instead, it can emerge from the interaction between small weaknesses across different systems. A slight degradation in life support efficiency, combined with increased radiation exposure, combined with delayed communication, can slowly reduce crew performance. Reduced performance can increase the chance of operational errors, and operational errors can increase stress on mechanical systems, which then increases the probability of further failures. This layered interaction is what makes Mars missions fundamentally different from most engineering projects on Earth. When survival probability is modeled across the full mission duration, including transit, surface operations, and return, the risk does not remain static. It increases with time because each additional month in space introduces more opportunities for system degradation, human fatigue, environmental exposure, and random failure events. Even if individual systems are highly reliable, the combined mission duration creates a long exposure window where small probabilities begin to accumulate into meaningful overall risk. This is why Mars today is survivable only in short-controlled simulations or highly managed experimental conditions, where every variable is monitored, backup systems are available, and external support is still within reach. Once those support systems are removed, and once communication delays and distance become permanent factors, the mission shifts into a different category of risk entirely, where survival depends on continuous perfect operation of multiple independent systems over long periods of time without external correction. Future Mars mission roadmaps focus less on a single breakthrough and more on a sequence of systems that must all mature at the same time before permanent human presence becomes realistic. Radiation shielding must improve to the point where long-term exposure is no longer medically critical. Autonomous repair systems must become capable of handling mechanical failures without human intervention from Earth. Industrial-scale in situ resource utilisation must be able to produce fuel, oxygen and water reliably on Mars itself, and ascent systems must reach a level of reliability where return is not dependent on a single fragile launch opportunity. What becomes clear across all current development paths is that Mars is not blocked by one missing invention, but by the absence of multiple mature systems working together at the same time under extreme conditions. Each piece is being developed, tested and improved, but none of them are yet at the level where they can safely support long-duration human survival without external intervention. Mars is not unreachable in a physical sense because the rockets, trajectories and landing methods already exist in partial form, but it is still unlivable in the sense that no current combination of technology can guarantee human survival for the full cycle of travel, surface stay and return without accepting a significant level of unresolved risk.